So Nick says, hi all, longtime user of TrainerRoad and listener of the podcast. I've become that guy in my tri club who is constantly referencing things I've learned here, for better or worse. My question is about differing bike cadences for different race lengths. I've been reading that cadence in the high 90s are more efficient for sprint distance triathlons, but the cadence in the low 80s are more efficient for long course events. I think I understand why this makes sense mechanically in the same way that a car engine produces more power at high RPM and is more efficient cruising on the highway at low RPM. However, a car engine doesn't have to deal with lactic acid buildup at low RPM. We've talked about the lactic acid myth before, by the way, and all the misconceptions that exist around that. But we can say metabolic byproduct. How about that? That can build up at low RPM. He says, so my question is, why is it supposed to be more efficient or otherwise gets you a faster overall time for that energy used, pedaling at a lower RPM over longer distances? And is this even good advice? Thanks so much and love the podcast, from Nick. So this is a really common question that we've heard at all levels of triathlon, right? It's very common. There's like an assumption. I mean, even the name slow twitch exists for a reason, right? Like there's this assumption that pedaling slower is better in that sort of environment. And we're going to get really deep into this. Chad, you did a ton of research, which thank you for doing that. Nate leans right back when we say that. But I want to just cover some really quick basics before we go into that, to stop people from feeling like they may be experiencing whiplash as we go throughout the research here. So the first things first to have in mind here, for most cycling disciplines that we're talking about, a broad range of cadence is important for race day, or perhaps better said, a specific range of cadence is best for that day. For example, if you know that you're going to be riding something and it's just really steep and you're going to be under geared, for some reason, you will be in that situation. You should be prepared to be able to spin at lower cadences, right? And the opposite is true too. So really, it's good to be prepared for a bunch of things if we're talking about very kind of broader general circumstances. And then it's also good to remember, we're good at what we do. So if you are a person that rides at 85 RPM and you never vary from that, you'll be really good at that. That doesn't mean that you are worse relatively to other people just naturally at riding at 100 RPM or 70 RPM. But just because you're not used to it means that you won't perform instantly at the level you would expect or hope to be able to perform when you ride at that cadence. So that's why we have like varied recommendations for cadence during a workout, trying to work you within a range and trying to help you be specifically prepared, that sort of a thing. So with all that said, those are the general recommendations, but it's fun to dig into the science behind this and to look into things a little more.
Those recommendations are based on research. I mean, we're not just pulling this out of thin air. There's quite a lot of data, a lot of research on this particular topic. And it's a potentially very contentious one. A lot of people have a lot of opinions on it, and there is a lot of research which can allow you to bend your take on the issue to suit what you believe. There's quite a lot out there. So Nick, I see your questions. Let me reframe them or just restate them. You're basically asking, is lower cadence more efficient? Does greater efficiency automatically yield better performance? And kind of lumped in with that, does efficiency trump higher watts? And then is there an optimal cadence? These are the questions as I see it. So I'm going to address each of those. And Jonathan gave me away. I was going to pretend that this is going to be really quick. It's very not.
I'm going to grab my snorkel. I'm just going to grab a lot of info quick for this deep dive, because this one's going.
It's a long one, but I'm going to try to make it interesting the whole time, and I'm going to provide a takeaway at periods throughout. So
I just scrolled through. It is a long one. Chad, do you want us to interject, or you want us to just let you go?
No, I absolutely want you to interject. And I'm super happy to see that there's some colored comments, some pink and some orange, that wove their way into this morning, because this is going to be a heck of a long monologue.
Behind the scenes reveal right there, Chad, on how we organize ourselves.
So we've learned a couple things along the way. Okay, so let's talk about that first question a bit. Is lower cadence more efficient? And when we talk about efficiency, we're really talking about lower oxygen costs. There are a lot of ways to interpret efficiency, but for our purposes today and for the purposes of cadence, we're almost always talking about reducing the oxygen cost of exercise, pedaling the bike. So dating way back like 20 years ago, Veronique Billat, we've talked about her many times. A lot of our workouts are formulated around things she's picked up relative to VO2 max and short shorts and the short VO2 max intervals. And she looked at the effects of cadence and stride rate on something that's called the VO2 slow component amplitude. And that's a whole lot of scientific jargon, but really what she's asking, or what she's looking at, is do different cadences, do different stride rates push us more quickly to exhaustion? So she took 8 triathletes and they ran and they rode to exhaustion at a particular output. So they found a happy spot between their lactate threshold, for our purposes, FTP, and 50% of that difference and their power at VO2 max. So mathematically, that would calculate out to be somewhere around 110% FTP. So their freely chosen RPM and strides per minute, the cadence on the bike fell between 72 and 92 across athletes. Their stride rate 90 to 95, so substantially a little bit quicker in a substantially narrower range. And then they had a low cadence intervention where they went just 10 RPM or 10 strides per minute below that. And in both cycling and running, they found no effect on this of cadence on this VO2 slow component. Excuse me. So the takeaway in this case is that a higher cadence didn't bring about fatigue at this super maximal effort level any lower or any quicker than that slightly lower cadence.
Yeah, I thought this was really interesting because when I first started cycling, my quote unquote natural cadence was to be a real masher. Like I had a really, really low cadence. And at that point, because I hadn't really done anything else, trying to train at high cadence was really challenging and very fatiguing because it required a lot of extra focus from me, which was a higher cognitive load. And that kind of gave me the sensation that I was getting fatigued.
Nice.
Nice. That's totally it. So, but with practice, like later in my career, I specifically trained higher cadence. And as I got better at it, it required a lot less focus and it felt easier. I don't know that it was more efficient technically, but I'm curious about the role of cognitive load in this because, with no science to back this up whatsoever, just based on personal anecdote, I would be really, I wonder about that.
Yeah. I feel like that gets compounded. I felt that too, Amber. And I feel like it gets compounded when you get onto variable terrain where traction is tricky. Nate, your recent camp that you had at Moab, when you're trying to go up tricky things or like ledgy things or anything like that, or even Pikes Peak Apex on that tricky, like first stage that you had that had some technical climbing and stuff like that. It is crazy how your cadence affects your ability to be able to go up something or go over something technical. And really, when you think about it, it's the reason it's so hard, I feel like in a lot of ways, like physically, yes, because you're managing torque and traction, but it's like a crazy refresh rate that's happening with your mind and your body constantly to be thinking of, okay, well, at my current cadence and the current force, and then where my tire's at, where my body's at, what sort of terrain it's on, the traction I have, you're running this constant feedback loop. And it can be really straining. And I've noticed that with a lot of people with mountain bikers or in tricky sections, they'll actually, in the beginning, it seems like they stray toward a low cadence. But if they have some experience riding in tricky situations, I see it very commonly, a high cadence is used to get through tricky technical stuff. And in many cases, my brain can't keep up with my legs in that scenario. And I can't compute everything that needs to be happening at the same time as me trying to interpret what's going on at the tire level, because that's so important. It's strange because suddenly every single degree of your pedal stroke has a consequence to you being able to maintain traction and forward momentum. Whereas when you're on the road with perfect traction, you simply don't have that. So to your point, Amber, I think that like the cognitive load part is huge, and it does affect us even on the road when we don't have that sort of tricky scenario, but it's compounded. So if you ever find yourself wondering why you feel so fatigued when you're riding anything like gravel or mountain biking or cyclocross where traction is limited, like a muddy day, those are so tricky. And a lot of it is just because you are running a faster refresh rate almost with all that data in between the tire all the way up to you. It's tough for sure. So
agreed. So, and I didn't dip into that at all, but that is a whole other avenue of interest that we could explore and probably dedicate about this depth of a deep dive. So in line with that, or following along with that same question, whether lower cadence is more efficient, does it lower the oxygen cost? There's a triplet of studies by Verkruyssen, and he wasn't the lead researcher on all of them, but he was a researcher on all of them. So we're just going to call them the Verkruyssen studies. he looked at triathletes in all three cases, and he used anywhere from 8 to 9 athletes. So small data pool, and you can criticize it if you want to, but that's pretty much how these things work. You can't get big pools, excuse me, of advanced level athletes. And in this case, they were. So they were national or regional levels. All of them had VO2 maxes in the very high 60s, 68, 69, high VO2 maxes. They were competent athletes. So in the first experiment, they did a 30-minute ride, and they followed it with a run to exhaustion. Now, they did 3 different interventions. The 30-minute ride was always at 90% of their lactate threshold. And the first one, they did it at the freely chosen cadence. And then the second one, they would do the first 20 minutes at the freely chosen cadence, and then they would either subtract 10 RPM or add 10 RPM for the 2 interventions. So just for that last 10 minutes, they would go a little faster or a little slower in terms of their leg speed, same power output. And then immediately they would do a run to fatigue at 85% of their running velocity. And what they found was that in the slower cadence group, that freely chosen minus 20 RPM, time to fatigue took 4 minutes longer. So they attribute this maybe due to a lower metabolic load in the final 10 minutes of that lower cadence riding. Then they did another similar experiment, 3 cycling, riding experiments where they did 30 minutes of riding, 15 minutes of running. And then they also, in almost all cases, they do a control run. So they'll take that same amount of time, 45 minutes, and just do a run so they can see how it compares to not having a cycling bout involved. So with the cycling running bouts, this is where it gets really interesting. They did an energetically optimized cadence, and they found that fell in the 68 to 76. They used gas exchange, they used lab data to determine that. They did a freely chosen cadence, and then they did a theoretically mechanically optimized, and this is based on a Neptune Hull study back in 1999, where they just looked at the neuromuscular perspective of optimizing cadence, and they found that to fall at 90 RPM. So they used these three cadences, and what they found was that oxygen consumption increased during the freely chosen and the mechanically optimized, but not the energetically optimized. So the faster cadences increased oxygen consumption a bit. This is not surprising. They also found that there was greater oxygen consumption, VO2 variability in both those faster cadences. So it danced around a little more. So the takeaways here are that the oxygen cost of cycling actually went up, and that VO2 slow component crept into their runs. So they had to, they paid a little more on the bike, and then they escalated toward fatigue a little more quickly on the run. And then the other takeaway is that the energetically optimized cadence, that low cadence, led to a stability in their oxygen cost once they got to the run. So they held on more evenly as they were running. It didn't creep toward that level of, or toward exhaustion quite as quickly. And then finally, another similar study, 3 cycling and run interventions, and they followed this with a 3-kilometer run. And then of course they did a control run, which was just the run. So these were 20-minute rides, and they worked at 80% of their VO2 max, and they either had them pedal at 60 RPM, 80 RPM, or 100 RPM. And what they found was, no surprise, run performance suffered in all cases if it was preceded by a bike ride. The bike takes a little bit out of your legs, no surprise. But what was surprising, that, well, maybe not, but what they also learned was that in the first 500 meters, the stride rate and the run speed were higher after the 80 and 100 RPM rides. So they carried that quicker cadence into a quicker stride rate. So the takeaways here is first, that there's no significant effect of cadence within the usual triathlon cadence range, according to this study. And secondly, that 60 RPM was associated with higher sustained fractional utilization during the run. So they had to work they were capable of working at a higher level of output, which means it probably ran faster. So, and then another takeaway is that they previously did a similar study where they used 5K runs, and they saw better run performance following this metabolic load reduction. So when they, again, pedaled at that 60 RPM, they had slightly better 5K runs. So the overall takeaway for that trio of studies is that the metabolic cost tends to increase with cycling cadence, and 60 RPM is in fact the most economical. It's the lowest amount of oxygen for the work performed. Okay, so we know this is real. However, that is not the whole story. So now the question shifts more towards, does efficiency trump higher power? So,
there's a catch.
Yes.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Because that's the other thing too. A lot of the time, this is for some reason discussed devoid of the context that really matters there. That like, it's talking all about cadence and efficiency without talking about the fact that, well, power is the main determinant of your speed when you're out on that bike course. So,
So it kind of shifts the emphasis to mechanism and not really outcome. We want to know, does this improve performance?
Can I summarize some of this part? Because my brain was going in and out. And I honestly, this is one of those ones where I act them and I'd like try to summarize. I know what I'm talking about. I really don't know. So the VO2 slow component, I totally missed that part. That's where the VO2 creeps up over time.
Yeah. So anytime you're, above that theoretical limit, the metabolic limit, whether it's critical power, functional threshold, or lactate threshold, you ride above that, and eventually you're going to supposedly achieve your VO2 max if you ride long enough.
That's where you're doing like 102% of FTP, but then after a while, it feels like a VO2 max at the end.
Supposedly, yeah. I find it hard to believe with such being just slightly above FTP, but when you're well above it, obviously you get there, and you get there pretty rapidly the farther above it you are.
So what these 3 studies are showing is that at the end of your triathlon leg, if you slowed your cadence down lower than what you normally do, pretty low, you would then run faster. Is that correct?
Yes, or at least reduce the oxygen costs. So reduce the oxygen cost during the latter part of the cycling so that when you do run, you have a little more energy to devote to running.
Great. So this has been I don't know, maybe it is actual science recommended many times. Although I also heard the opposite of people say you need to match your cycling cadence. Because there's a lot of tradition with coaches about what they recommend.
There is, and we've only looked at one aspect or one facet of this whole argument.
Right. Okay, I'm back on path or track.
Okay. So again, let me reiterate, metabolic cost tends to increase with cadence. So we have to expend a little more energy, use a little more oxygen as our cadence improves, 60 RPM being the most economical, lowest amount of oxygen necessary. However, this brings us to the question whether or not efficiency trumps higher power. So we are typically good at reducing the metabolic cost of repetitive motions, whether it be running or maybe not rowing, but running is probably the one that heads the list. We tend to find movement patterns that minimize our energy expenditure. So basically through repetition, we gravitate toward efficiency. It happens whether we're conscious of it or not. But in cycling, and when I say we, I mean both trained cyclists and untrained cyclists, self-select cadences that are quicker than the most energy efficient ones. That for whatever reason isn't our goal. And so the question is asked, and one of the studies, I quote, attributes it to muscle mechanical requirements and their activation conditions. Again, a lot of scientific jargon, but what they're saying is that muscle fibers, or what they're pointing out, is that muscle fibers have an optimal length for force production. So at a particular length of a fiber, it can exert the most force. Muscle fibers also experience an exaggerated decrease in force as velocity increases. So the more quickly we spin the pedals, the less force we can put into them. That's that whole force velocity relationship.
It's just like a power meter, right, Chad? In the sense that the faster you spin the power meter, the less force you have to put out to equal a given wattage.
You can put out, yeah.
Yep. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can feel this on the trainers. So like this is so clear when you're on the trainer. If you're doing a steady state effort, if you slow down that cadence on a smart trainer, it's going to ramp up the resistance, and you can really feel the difference between 70 RPM at that power output and 100 RPM at that output. It is a massive difference. So I'm really curious, and I don't know if I don't think this was part of the studies or anything, but it makes me wonder if this is trainable at the muscle fiber level like that. I have no idea. And maybe that's a really stupid question.
I don't know. I would guess that muscle characteristics are what they are. So you have to figure out how to abide their rules and their limits.
Yeah.
But that's a fair question.
So
I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. So this combination, so their optimal length for force production, and then this whole force velocity relationship means that peak power is often observed at faster contraction speeds. So faster cadences, faster muscular contractions than peak efficiency. So this creates this peak power and this peak efficiency misalignment, telling us that we can't have both simultaneously, or can we? Back in 2004, Lucia looked at and had a study that was titled "Low Cadences Are Less Efficient in Pro Roadies," and all these studies are linked. So they took Lucia and colleagues took 8 male professional cyclists, had them do 3 6-minute efforts at roughly 360 watts, so high power at either 60, 80, or 100 RPM. And what they noticed was that gross efficiency, and this is the amount of energy we don't lose to heat. So the percentage that we actually put into the pedals at 60 RPM was 22.4, at 80 was 23.6, at 100 grew all the way to 24.2. So almost exactly the opposite of what we'd expect to see. As they spun faster, they became more economical. So the takeaway here, one, is that pro riders at high power outputs actually saw improved gross efficiency or economy at increasing cadence. The higher outputs paired with higher levels of competency, because that is a factor. They have to be good at it. They can't just push big watts. Different rules apply.
Huh. Yeah.
Nate, I think you're muted.
Muted.
Better at what you do.
Yeah, no, that's about it.
Yeah. So this is an interesting thing because it it kind of breaks. There's an assumption that because you're moving faster, and this isn't really looking at the actual mechanical efficiency of the rider on the bike as well at this sort of range too, because if you're not used to riding at 100 RPM, you can feel really uncomfortable with that, right, Chad?
Yeah,
like
and that's exactly. That's where the competency enters the picture. So again, you can't just jam on the pedals, push out more watts, and expect those higher watts at higher cadences to all magically work themselves out.
Yeah, the subjects that were being studied here were professional road racers. So they're the sort of athletes that are really used to this. Like you said, Amber, and you started out slow, but then you got used to so much more because I think you had a few hours on the bike by the time you were a pro. So, and I'm sure pedaling at high cadence is like that. Chad, do you mind if I take like a quick interlude with this one to kind of just ask almost like an anecdotal example of what sort of cadences we ride at different events? Because I've noticed that it varies for me, and it's absolutely not like a voluntary or an active choice on my end to change that.
Can dictate, sure.
Yeah, like if I'm doing a criterium, it's not uncommon for me to be somewhere really close to 100 RPM. I find that I tend to ride like a faster cadence then. But then if I look at like a cross country race or a mountain bike race or anything like that, I'm almost always somewhere around 85. Am I in a rare situation here? Have you noticed that it changes? Maybe even TT bike to road bike, something like that?
It absolutely does. And then there's actually a review that I'll wrap this all up with that kind of sums that up. And it was done, about a decade ago, and it still pretty much holds true. I mean, there's a whole lot of new data over the course of that last decade, but none of it really refutes these initial basic findings.
Interesting. Did you notice that too, Amber, for you? Did like with time trials or like a time trial versus a road race, did you ever see like a wildly different cadence?
Yeah. And actually, I mean, I would really vary my cadence depending on the terrain too. So if it was early in a time trial and I was going uphill, I would really focus on a higher cadence versus if it were just flat or on a downhill, I could get away with a slightly lower cadence. And I would be much more mindful of that in the beginning than at the end, because the sensation to me was just if I could maintain a higher cadence going uphill early on, that my legs felt fresher towards the end of the race. And that's pure anecdote. But it was really terrain dependent for me. And the other thing, I mean, even like in crits, having a lighter gear going into a corner so I could spin out of the corner and I didn't get stuck in a big gear when I'm trying to accelerate out of that corner and having to mash too hard. So little things like that over the years, but very like not necessarily from event to event, but just like specific components of races. I would be mindful of my cadence for different reasons.
Interesting.
Okay.
Stuff.
Am I back?
Nate's back. You're back, Nate.
My entire system audio died all at once. Okay. I don't know what you guys are talking about, but it sounds like these, I don't know if that's like just my concussion or what. It sounds like these pro riders have, what's it called? Souplesse.
Yeah,
And
it sounds like the triathletes don't, right? And, sorry, triathletes. Like I love you too, because I am at heart a triathlete, but I wonder if that has anything to do with it, with like how you train and stuff. And also you don't see many triathletes like spin at 100 RPM when they're going. It just feels weird on a TT bike where for pro cyclists, you see it a lot.
Yes.
It goes back to Amber's question about like, can you train it? Right.
Yeah. And it kind of dovetails into the next question that I hope to answer, or at least shed a bit of light on, which is, does greater efficiency mean better performance? Is improved efficiency the holy grail? Is it all we're after? One study by Brennan just a couple of years ago took capable, but not competitive cyclists, and they had them pedal at 40, 60, 80, 100 RPM or their preferred RPM, where they basically blinded them to what their RPM was. They found out that this preferred RPM settled at 81 plus or minus 12. So we're talking whether when they didn't have data to tell them how quickly they were spinning, they landed somewhere between 70 and 90 RPM. And what they found was that peak power capacity occurred at 80 RPM. But the metabolic cost was greatest, at 100 RPM, minimal at 40 RPM. This all is in line with what we've talked about so far. So the takeaway with this particular study was that lower cadences resulted in contraction speeds well below the muscle's power capacity. So the speed of contraction was too slow to be powerful. Okay. So it is a necessary component to crank out big watts. So, and again, cyclists naturally gravitate towards greater power. And it's a bit of a side note, but it was interesting because in this study, Brennan referred to a previous study just a year prior where they observed an increase in a term, series elastic contribution, in absorbing and generating energy at a greater muscular tendinous unit shortening velocity. So the translation of all that scientific jargon is that they were suggesting that quicker spins become more efficient due to an elastic response. I didn't dig into this, but I did find it very interesting because we as endurance athletes or cyclists specifically, we pedal the bike. So it's all concentric. We push down on the pedals, we push down on the pedals. There's no real eccentric component. There's no elastic component of it. But this suggests that as we spin more quickly, we might actually get a little bit of the benefit from that whole stretch shortening cycle that we see when we do plyometrics and reactive and explosive training. Interesting. Like I said, I didn't dig into it. There might not be anything to it, but I thought I'd bring it up anyway. So anyway, the overall
there's probably a difference in that too between seated and standing, right?
Oh,
like
yeah,
you're
for
standing
sure.
Up a climb versus seated.
For sure.
That's a really interesting question.
And it
Cool.
just sheds a little bit of light on how very complex all this is. So when you're saying, when you're asking simple questions to something like this, I can't give a simple answer. There isn't one. It's just not a simple
Be careful
matter.
the questions you ask, you guys.
Seriously, because I am maybe halfway done here. No, actually,
we have a bazooka handy, and we'll use it no matter the size of the fly.
Okay, so there is a really good takeaway from this, though, and that is that it is that different race durations alter your priorities. Longer races seem to favor efficiency over watts. News to nobody. Shorter races seem to favor power over efficiency. Again, news to nobody. You can get away with a lot less when your energy supply isn't as big a deal. Okay, so this brings us to one more question. Does greater efficiency automatically yield better performance? I think this is the question, right? Mm-hmm. So Gary 2005 looked at cadence and its effects on 10K performance. So again, we're back to the whole, running off the bike sort of thing. And they had 3 times 65-minute rides at either a slow, preferred, or a fast cadence. And the preferred cadence, they basically altered it plus or minus 15. So they went 15 below, 15 above. And this had people settle in the 70s for the slow, 80s for the preferred, 90s for the fast. And what they found was that cycling affected 10K in all cases with no cadence effect. Didn't matter. This range of 70 to 90 RPMs didn't affect their 10K performance. However, in the first 500 meters, they saw higher run speeds with the quicker cadence, the preferred cadence plus 15. I found this interesting because I think the takeaway here is that this could benefit a tight battle. I mean, I did duathlons for a guy I was so even with on the bike that we always cut off at the same time. And I feel like if one of us could have carried a slightly faster stride rate into that first 500 meters and opened up just a little bit of a gap because we ran really evenly too, that could have been the deciding factor.
We're going to do a triathlon where I'm going to come in with Chad and we're just going to try to outspin each other.
Yeah.
We're just going to go faster,
140
RPM. Get that edge off the bike.
Yeah, for sure.
Someone film that, please. That'll be
playable
amazing.
strategy. We're going to do that.
This is so like a lot of stuff in science, all of these are contradicting each other. I'm not the only one hearing this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's
kind of where I'm going with
Annoying.
this. Okay. So back in line with this, does this greater efficiency automatically yield better performance? 2002 study by Yinger and colleagues looked at prior cycling on running performance and kinematics. So, how you run. They did 30 minutes race pace and they did a freely chosen cadence, which settled around 90 versus a plus or minus 20%, which put them at 110 on the high end, 70% on the low end, followed by a 3.2 kilometer run. So with this slightly faster cadence, 110 RPM, that led to approximately a minute faster run than the guys who rode at 70 RPM. And they attributed this to stride rate, but no change in length. It didn't change their mechanics at all. So as far as kinematics went, foot strike, mid stance, toe off, mid swing, all those things just the same, no effect. So Nick, this may still be shorter than the sprint triathlons or the sprint tri runs, which are 5Ks, if I'm not mistaken. But who's to say you couldn't drag this improvement in run performance out for another couple of kilometers?
This is an interesting point, Chad, because it kind of goes down to how we get used to things and we adapt to things at different scale, in the sense that if you're used to that rate just for the last 10 minutes of the ride, then that could, it could affect how you run. But then there's also the other side of it where it works at a much bigger scale, where it depends on where you train as well. Because I like, one thing that I could hear from this, if I'm a triathlete listening to this, I think, okay, so now for the last 10 minutes of every bike, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ride at 120 RPM. And then that's just automatically going to cut a minute off my run, right? Based off of that study. But if we're not used to doing that at all, that may bring in a different set of circumstances and consequences that could actually harm us and hold us back. Like, you can't just do something that you're entirely not used to on race day, even though we do it nonstop. But you can't just do something that you're not used to at all on race day and then assume that it's going to work out like this, especially when we're talking about making your body work at a different rate that it's used to, or just in a different pattern than it's used to.
And also consider these are all lab controlled experiments too. So they have people riding stationary bikes and running on treadmills. So a lot of variables that happen in the great outdoors do not happen necessarily in a lab environment.
Cool. So I guess the next question then would be, is it optimal?
Question.
Like, is
so,
there what should I ride at?
Exactly. And that, so, you know, performance aside, is there performance still included, but is there an optimal cadence? So one study in particular, 2009, Ainsley and Kangley, pointed out a couple of things that I think are worth mentioning. First, the literature presents conflicting results when we talk about optimal cadence. Sometimes optimal looks at the energetic cost, minimizing that. Sometimes it looks at minimizing the muscular stress. Sometimes it looks at minimizing perception of effort. This is further confounded in that higher power outputs change things, as we just saw. So the authors here, these two, concluded that, or proposed, that the relationship between the energetic demands, between the power output, and between the muscle stress, mash them all together, is actually optimized where perception of exertion is minimized. So basically, do what feels best, and optimization takes care of itself. And honestly, I have to agree with this, because think about, and we're going to go with extremes here, but think about a match sprint versus an Ironman triathlon. No one's going to do a match sprint where they're trying to jam out 1,800, 2,000 watts at 60 RPM. It's not going to happen. And no one's going to ride a 112-mile bike leg at 110 or 115 RPM. So, and they're not going to need to be told that. That's just going to take care of itself. They're going to put this together on their own. Okay, so another, in line with this, idea of an optimal cadence, was another 2000 study. They had, these ones I really like because, man, were they thorough. They either worked at 100, 200, 300, or 400 watts, and they varied it 50, 60, 80, 100, or 120 RPM. And they looked at electromyographic feedback, EMG feedback, on 7 muscles. So talk about thorough. And they found that the optimal cadence increases with increased power output. Again, we've discussed this. So the one thing they pointed out was that muscle activation at a given power output is minimized at a unique cadence. And that unique cadence is higher at a higher power output. So there's a particular combination. And they also cited a previous study by Coast and Welch where they did roughly the same thing. They looked at power outputs between 100 and 300 watts, RPMs between 40 and 120 RPMs, with the goal of finding the minimal oxygen consumption combinations. For instance, they found that at 100 watts, 40 RPM had the lowest oxygen cost. At 300 watts, 80 RPM had the lowest oxygen cost. So the efficiency of the muscle contraction is actually highest at velocities slightly lower than the optimal velocity for our peak power output. I'll explain what that means. And this was regardless of fiber type. So translated, the most favorable muscle conditions occur when we're just below these minimal VO2 combinations. So for whatever reason, when we ride just below that, everything seems to work out. So the takeaway here is that optimal cadence is different at different power outputs. This again is something we've seen before, and it just makes sense. Then I'm going to conclude this with that review that I talked about earlier, which, this was 10 years ago, but, it looked at 80 studies that actually fulfilled its search criteria. So 80 studies actually worked for them. And what did they find? 100 to 120 RPM improved sprinting because it reduced the force necessary, reduced the neuromuscular fatigue, maximized power output. Yes, it did it at a high metabolic cost, but it's a sprint. Who cares? Roughly 90 to 100 RPM may benefit prolonged cycling and road time trials. News to nobody. 70 to 90 RPM might improve ultra endurance performance greater than 4 hours. And they attribute that to improved economy and lower oxygen demands. So that this was done, 11 years ago, looking at 80 different studies. And it basically just told us everything we discovered across more recent studies and some older ones. So to wrap up, is lower cadence more efficient? Yes, bioenergetically. In terms of oxygen costs, it is. Does greater efficiency automatically yield better performance? Does efficiency trump higher watts? Depends. And is there an optimal cadence? Depends. And it's really hard to pinpoint. There are too many variables.
Well, the efficiency though, that's sorry, Amber. There's there's that one study with the pros though, where they were more efficient at 100.
Yeah.
So I would not say
But it
across
depends.
the board.
Oh yeah, you're right. Not across the board. Correct.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say, this is a really good example of why you should never just read one study and draw conclusions.
Right. Yeah. A great example of that. And here's the interesting thing. A lot of, I guess that kind of what it backs up is the fact that we do within a reasonable range. We're good at what we're used to. We're good at what we train at. And then it's also interesting to see that in this case, what we see athletes doing at the higher end of things, and even just, what we've experienced, us individual athletes, that, Amber is high end, but for the rest of us non-pro athletes here, we've experienced something similar and kind of noticed something that gravitates toward that sort of a thing. And a criterium, something like that, I'll have faster cadence. When I'm sprinting, I've looked at all of my sprint PRs or my power PRs for power output, and they always occur somewhere around like 100 RPM. They're a little higher than you'd think. A lot of the time we feel like we put out a bunch of power when we drop it down to 70 RPM in a big heavy gear, and then we compress it really hard. But that peak power actually comes once we can get some spin going into those legs as well. So to recap, in terms of for triathlon in particular, for Nick in this scenario, if you're doing longer distance stuff, then it seems like the data is showing that if you ride at a slightly lower cadence and you're used to that, then that's probably going to be better for you. If you're doing something shorter, then you're probably going to be focusing more on your power output, and then you'll want to be doing something faster.